The smell of stale grease and desperation clung to Alara like cheap cologne. It was 3:17 a.m. The Golden Spatula, a place that promised comfort food, but only delivered chronic indigestion and the relentless, high-pitched whine of the broken neon sign. Her shift had started 12 hours ago, and every muscle fiber screamed in protest, a chorus drowned out only by the mental calculation of her student loan interest. She was wiping down booth 7, the perpetually sticky vinyl relic, when she felt it. Not saw it, but felt it. A low, insistent thrumming against the worn wood. A vibration so subtle it was almost silent, yet powerful enough to make the condensation on the sugar packets dance. It was the sound of something expensive, something dangerous, demanding attention. Ilara dropped to her knees, ignoring the pain in her joints. Beneath the scarred table, nestled against a discarded gum wrapper and a crust of dried ketchup, lay a phone. It wasn't the chipped, cracked plastic that usually littered the floor after the late-night rush. This was obsidian black, seamless, the kind of device that looked like it was forged in an entirely different reality. It was heavy in her palm, cool to the touch, and unnervingly pristine. A burner phone, undoubtedly, and one that cost more than her month's rent. She stood up, flexing her cramped fingers. The vibration had stopped, but the screen pulsed, dark and demanding. This sensible thing would have been to toss it into the lost and found box. Let the owner deal with the inconvenience. But Ilara was tired, and being tired made her stupidly honest. If she could return it to the careless bastard who left it, maybe she could stop calculating how many more years she had to serve lukewarm coffee to strangers. She slid the phone into the back pocket of her uniform jeans, intending to wait out the rest of the hour. But then it vibrated again, 2 sharp, silent bursts. An incoming call. Ilara hesitated. The phone felt like a lump of cold iron pressing against her spine. She pulled it out, staring at the screen. No number, just a blank, ominous void. The exhaustion won. She pressed the answer icon, lifting the device to her ear. Hello? Her voice was a dry croak, strained from too much caffeine and too little sleep. Silence. Not the static-laced silence of a bad connection, but a profound, heavy quiet, like standing on the edge of a deep well. She was about to hang up, convinced it was a wrong number, when a voice cut through the void. It was low, gravelly, and laced with an authority that didn't request obedience, it commanded it. It was a voice that sounded like fine whiskey poured over crushed ice, utterly cold and impossibly smooth. Where the hell have you been? I've been waiting. Ilara's breath hitched. She was instantly defensive. Look, I think you have the wrong number. I just found this phone. If you can tell me where I can drop it off. Silence. The single word, spoken without inflection, slammed into her chest like a physical blow. The air in the diner, the stale, greasy air, suddenly felt thin. She realized with a sickening lurch that this man wasn't talking to a stranger. He was talking through her, assuming the identity of the person who owned the phone. Listen to me carefully. The voice continued, dropping even lower, the tone shifting from annoyance to lethal precision. The window is closing. Vasily Ivanov just cleared customs. I need him intercepted before he reaches the safe house in Chelsea. Ilara's hand began to tremble, the expensive phone suddenly slick with sweat. Intercepted. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. You know the protocol. No witnesses, no mess. I don't care how you do it, but I want a clean sweep. Pier 4, now." The name Vasily Ivanov and the location Pier 4 burned into her memory. These weren't details about an overdue delivery or a missed business meeting. This was a command, a death sentence, delivered with the chilling nonchalance of ordering takeout. "Wait, stop," Alara whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought the sound might travel through the mic. "I don't know who you are. I don't know what you're talking about." For the first time, the man paused. Ilara heard a faint, distant sound on the line. The scrape of leather, perhaps, or the soft click of a door closing. Then a low, dangerous chuckle, devoid of humor. "You answered my call, little ghost. That was your mistake." The line went dead. Ilara stood frozen beneath the flickering neon, the phone still pressed to her ear, ringing with the terrifying silence of absolute finality. She hadn't just found a lost object. She had reached through the veil and grasped the hot, lethal machinery of a world she had never known existed. And now, the machine knew her name. The silence that followed the dial tone was louder than any scream. It didn't just mark the end of the call, it marked the end of Alara's life as she knew it. The expensive phone, the instrument of her undoing, felt like a live grenade in her grasp. She stared at the black screen, seeing not her reflection, but the gaping mouth of the abyss she just peered into. Vasily Ivanov. The name tasted like ash. Pier 4, intercepted, clean sweep. These were words from headlines Ilara usually skimmed, whispers of a brutal underworld that operated far beyond the reach of her minimum wage existence. But now she wasn't skimming, she was knee-deep in the wreckage. She shoved the phone back into her pocket, the cold outline pressing painfully against her lower back. She had to ditch it, throw it in the river, bury it under concrete. But the thought of getting rid of the evidence felt like admitting guilt, and she hadn't done anything wrong, not really. She had just answered a call. Adrenaline, sharp and sickening, chased away the fatigue. She grabbed her threadbare jacket and fled the golden spatula, not bothering to clock out. The air outside was cold, smelling of diesel and coming rain. She ran blindly, the broken neon sign, the G-spat-to flickering behind her like a dying lighthouse. She didn't know who the man was, but she knew he was a force, and forces, especially deadly ones, didn't tolerate mistakes. She felt the weight of his attention settling on her, a physical pressure that made her lungs burn. She was no longer running from the shift manager. She was running from a ghost in the machine, and she knew, with terrifying certainty, that he knew exactly where she was. Damon Volkov stood in the center of his soundproof office, the panoramic view of the city reduced to a meaningless backdrop. He was impeccably dressed, even at this hour, in charcoal gray Italian wool that moved like a second skin. He held his own secured communication device, its data readout screaming a violation. "Repeat the voice analysis," he commanded, his voice level, betraying none of the cold, lethal fury churning in his gut. He was a man accustomed to flawless execution. This breach was an insult. Female, mid-20s, possibly younger, unstressed vocal cords, likely civilian, American accent. High anxiety, the clipped voice of his tech analyst, Costa, reported through the speaker. Damon closed his eyes briefly. A civilian. An accident. The wrong person found the device and, in a moment of staggering stupidity, answered the most secure line in the entire Volkov network, and she had heard everything. Vasily Ivanov, Pier 4, the protocol for a clean execution. The entire operation was now contaminated. The GPS coordinates, Damon said, the words sharp enough to draw blood. He didn't care about the phone. He cared about the woman attached to the phone. Secrets were currency in his world, and this woman was now holding the equivalent of a nuclear warhead. The signal is moving, boss, originating from a dumpster fire called the Golden Spatula. It's erratic now, southbound, near the docks. East 14th Street alleyway. Damon's jaw tightened. He didn't need to send anyone. This was too sensitive for proxies. He needed to look into her eyes when he dealt with her. He needed to assess the depth of the contamination himself. Cancel the sweep of the location. I'm going myself. And Costa, Damon paused, the silence stretching taut. If anyone breathes a word of this breach, I will ensure they never breathe again. He didn't wait for a reply, cutting the line. Within minutes, the black armored SUV was tearing through the pre-dawn streets. Damon watched the tracking dot flicker on his screen, a tiny, insignificant spark, leading him directly to the most expensive mistake of his career. Ilara collapsed against a rusted steel dumpster in a narrow alley, the stench of forgotten garbage overwhelming the cool night air. Her lungs seized, burning with every ragged inhale. She'd cut through 3 blocks, doubling back twice, convinced she was being followed. The phone was still heavy in her pocket, broadcasting her location like a beacon. She yanked it out, intending to smash it against the brick wall. But just as she raised her hand, a deep, resonant sound echoed from the mouth of the alley. Not footsteps, but the deliberate, almost silent glide of expensive leather soles on wet pavement. Ilara froze, her breath catching high in her throat. The alley was swallowed by shadow, but a figure detached itself from the gloom. He was tall, impossibly so, and dressed in clothing that looked absurdly pristine against the backdrop of grime and decay. He moved with a predatory grace that didn't belong on the street or anywhere near a place like the Golden Spatula. His face was a masterpiece of cold, angular precision, high cheekbones, a severe mouth, and eyes the color of glacially deep water that surveyed her with terrifying lack of emotion. He stopped 10 feet away, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying power. This was not a misplaced businessman. This was the voice from the phone, embodied. "You're out of breath, little ghost," Damon said, his voice the same low, gravelly timbre that had commanded silence hours earlier. It wrapped around her, silencing the frantic pounding of her own heart. Ilara took a shaky step back, hitting the cold steel of the dumpster. I don't know who you are. I was going to call the police. I found your phone. It was a mistake. I didn't hear anything important." She hated how thin and desperate her voice sounded. Damon took 2 slow, measured steps toward her, eliminating the distance Ilara had desperately tried to maintain. He didn't raise his voice, yet the authority was crushing. Denial is tiresome. You heard my instructions. You heard the name. You have my property, and therefore you have my liability. His gaze dropped to her pocket, the expensive phone vibrating faintly beneath the cheap denim. "Give it to me," he ordered. Ilara fumbled, pulling out the phone and holding it out like a peace offering, her hand shaking violently. "Here, Take it, please. Just forget you saw me. Damon didn't take the phone. He reached out, his long fingers closing not around the device, but around her wrist. His touch was scorching, a jolt of raw electricity that momentarily paralyzed her fear. He was rough, yet deliberate, pulling her out from the shadow of the dumpster until she was pressed against his tailored suit. The scent of him, expensive cologne, leather, and something darkly masculine, flooded her senses, overwhelming the stench of the alley. She looked up, trapped by the intensity in his ice-blue eyes. "You answered my call, Ilara," he murmured, the use of her name an intimate, terrifying violation. He didn't ask for her name, he already knew it. "You've heard things that belong to me, secrets that define my life. And because I cannot risk you speaking them, I must possess them, and you." He tightened his grip, pulling her flush against the hard wall of his chest, the finality of his tone echoing in the confined space. "From now on, you're mine. Your mistake just cost you your freedom." The transition from the stench of the alley to the insulated silence of Damon Volkov's armored vehicle was instantaneous and jarring. One moment, Ilara was pressed against cold, greasy steel. The next, she was swallowed by the soft, unforgiving leather of a world crafted for kings and predators. Damon's grip on her wrist remained non-negotiable, a band of burning iron that tethered her to his reality. She wasn't dragged, she was guided with such swift, decisive force that resistance was futile, a wasted expenditure of breath. The SUV was a fortress on wheels, tinted black and soundproofed against the vulgar noise of the city. The speed was terrifying, a smooth, relentless acceleration that bypassed the usual rules of traffic. Ilara tried to wrench free, her mind screaming a litany of protests, but her body felt useless, heavy with shock. She was pinned by his proximity, his thigh a hard, unyielding presence beside hers. "Settle, little ghost," he murmured, the rumble of his voice barely audible over the engine's low thrum. He hadn't looked at her since the alley, his eyes fixed forward, watching the reflection of the city lights streak across the glass. "You are safe now. Your frantic attempts at flight are over." "Safe?" Ilara finally managed, her voice cracking. "You kidnapped me. I want to go home. You have the phone. Just let me out." He turned his head slowly, and the glacial blue of his eyes finally settled on her. The look wasn't angry, which was somehow worse. It was the look a scientist gives a specimen under glass, disinterested, analytical, and utterly possessing. "You no longer have a home, Ilara. You have a sanctuary, and I am its keeper." The drive ended as abruptly as it began, culminating in a silent, subterranean garage carved beneath the foundation of one of the city's most exclusive towers. They ascended in an elevator lined with polished bronze, the speed defying gravity, pushing her stomach into her throat. Damon stood beside her, his presence a heavy, suffocating weight, watching the digital floor numbers climb relentlessly. The doors slid open onto a space that looked like the breath of winter had been solidified into architecture. Marble, glass, and steel defined the penthouse, a cold, luminous expanse perched impossibly high above the chaotic sprawl of Manhattan. The entire eastern wall was a sheet of glass, offering a dizzying, glittering view that made Ilara feel small, exposed, and terribly far from Earth. This was the Golden Cage, expensive, beautiful, and inescapable. Damon released her wrist, only to place a hand lightly on the small of her back, the gesture proprietary, guiding her across the vast expanse of white stone flooring. His touch wasn't affectionate, but a constant, subtle reminder of his command. He led her to a sectional sofa facing the breathtaking view. "Sit. You need to understand the gravity of your situation." Ilara remained standing, clutching her threadbare jacket around her chest, the cheap fabric feeling ludicrous against the silk pillows and designer furniture. "I already understand it. You're a criminal, and you've taken me because I heard too much. I promise you, I haven't told anyone. I won't tell anyone. Just let me walk out of here." Damon settled into the sofa, crossing one leg over the other with an economy of movement that spoke of deep, banked power. He gestured toward a sleek bar. "Vodka, scotch, or water?" "Choose the water, Ilara. You need a clear head." "I don't want anything from you," she spat, the defiance a nervous tremor in her voice. He sighed, a low, impatient sound, then retrieved a crystal glass of water himself and placed it on the low marble table between them. "You will do as you are told. Start practicing now." Ilara didn't touch the glass, but the command had the desired effect. It stopped her frantic rant. She braced herself against the back of the sofa, waiting for the inevitable threat. Damon leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes holding hers with unnerving intensity. "The man you heard me discussing, Vasily Ivanov, is currently being hunted by 3 different organizations, mine included. The details you overheard were classified. They are secrets that, if shared, could ignite a war, or, more simply, put a target on my head and anyone associated with me." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You are not a witness, Ilara. You are a security breach. You are a liability that must be contained. If I let you go, the moment you speak of what you heard, even to a therapist, even in a nightmare, you risk exposure, and you risk leading my enemies directly to me." "I'm not a threat," she whispered, feeling the foundation of her old life crumble beneath her feet. "Every civilian who stumbles into this world is a threat. You are a loose thread, Ilara, and loose threads must be woven back into the fabric or clipped entirely." His voice was dangerously soft. "I choose the former. You will remain here. You will be provided with everything you need: clothing, food, technology, comfort, anything. But you cannot leave this apartment without my explicit permission, and you will never be alone." Her blood ran cold. "You mean I'm a prisoner?" "I mean you are under my protection," he corrected, a chilling semantic shift. "And my control. This penthouse is monitored. Every door, every window, every digital device you touch. Your existence is now solely dependent on my security protocols and my whims. Attempt to defy the first, and you will learn the consequences of the second." Ilara felt a desperate surge of fury override her fear. She shoved herself away from the sofa, taking 2 steps toward the nearest exit, a massive, reinforced steel door disguised as part of the wall paneling. "I won't live like this. I have a life. I have classes, a job." Before she reached the door, Damon was there. He moved faster than she thought possible, his hand catching her shoulder and spinning her around, bringing her flush against his chest again. The expensive wool of his suit felt like armor, hard and unyielding. He lowered his head, his breath warm against her ear. the underlying scent of cedar and danger filling her lungs. Your job is irrelevant. Your classes are canceled. Your old life is a fiction that ended the moment you answered that phone. I own the secret you carry, Ilara, and since I cannot remove the secret from your mind, I must possess the mind itself. He lifted his hand from her shoulder and ran his thumb lightly, almost tenderly, along the line of her jaw. The gesture was possessive, a claim marked in fire. She stared up into his eyes, seeing not the promise of violence, but the absolute certainty of ownership. He wasn't threatening to hurt her. He was simply stating the new, terrifying reality. "This cage is golden, Ilara," Damon concluded, his voice dropping to a seductive, lethal purr. "But the bars are unbreakable. Welcome to your new existence." The air in the penthouse was chilled, circulating through the ventilation system with an expensive, inhuman hum. It felt sterile, designed to keep out all the unpleasant realities of the world, including Alara's frantic, ragged breathing. She stood near the massive, seamless window, the dizzying height making her knees weak, while Damon remained seated on the white sofa, watching her struggle against the invisible boundaries he had erected. "Look at me, Alara," he commanded, the authority in his voice cutting through the panic like a diamond stylus cutting glass. She resisted, fixing her gaze on the glittering panorama of the city below, a million lights that represented a freedom she could no longer access. I said, "Look at me." The steel in his tone was unmistakable. She turned slowly, her chin tilted in a brittle mask of defiance. "What? Are you going to threaten me again? I already know the rules. I'm a prisoner." Damon steepled his fingers, his eyes, the color of winter ice, never leaving hers. "You know the conditions of your containment, yes, but you don't yet know the rules of your submission. There is a difference. Containment keeps the secret safe. Submission ensures you remain safe." He stood, his height instantly dominating the vast room. He moved with the unhurried deliberation of a predator who knows its prey is already cornered. "The first rule is transparency, complete and total. I require a full accounting of your life, your history, your contacts, your habits, every weakness, every friend, every indiscretion. I want to know the topography of your mind, Alara, so I can predict every potential instability." "You want my life story?" she scoffed, the sound hollow. "Why? To catalog my failures? I worked 3 jobs to pay for college and lived in a cockroach-infested studio. There's no secret history. I'm nobody." "Everyone has secrets, little ghost. The difference is, yours are now mine to manage." He took a step closer. "Who did you talk to yesterday? Who do you owe money to? What memories keep you up at night? I want them all, laid out like offerings on this sterile floor." She crossed her arms, trying to shield herself from the sudden, invasive heat of his presence. "You have no right to that. My past is my own." "Your past is a potential security risk." He stopped a mere foot away, forcing her to crane her neck to meet his gaze. "And since you answered my call, Ilara, nothing about you remains your own. Everything you are, everything you were, is now subject to my review. You acknowledged the power imbalance when you accepted this cage. Now you must acknowledge the personal invasion." His possessiveness was a suffocating pressure, heavier than the armored walls of the penthouse. It fueled a desperate, reckless anger within her, a final flare of her old self fighting for survival. I won't tell you anything! You can't force me to talk. A slow, dangerous smile curved the severe line of his mouth. It was beautiful and utterly devoid of kindness. I don't need force, Ilara. I need leverage. I have already secured your physical freedom. Now I will secure your mental compliance. He lifted one hand, not to strike, but to simply rest his palm flat against the expanse of glass beside her head. The movement trapped her, sealing her between the terrifying height outside and the terrifying man inside. The expensive fabric of his suit brushed against her shoulder, and the scent of him, cedar and cold, refined power, overwhelmed her senses, momentarily short-circuiting her fear. You are resisting me, Damon observed, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that made the small hairs on her arms stand up. Tell me, is the resistance purely moral, or is it something else? It's moral, she whispered, but the lie tasted like dust. There was a sickening, electric tension thrumming between them, a dangerous recognition that had nothing to do with security protocols and everything to do with the way her body tightened under his gaze. His eyes narrowed, glacial observation giving way to something darker, hotter. He lowered his head, not breaking eye contact, invading her personal space with an aggressive precision that felt like a physical caress. His breath ghosted over her mouth, and the scent of him became intoxicating, a lethal lure. The second rule of submission, he continued, his voice barely a breath, is that you do not lie to me. Especially not about what you feel when I am this close. She inhaled sharply, the movement pressing her chest fleetingly against his. The immediate, searing heat that radiated off him was a shock, a sudden, brutal acknowledgement of the chemistry that sparked between them, ignoring the chasm of power and morality. I feel terror, she managed, her voice shaking, trying desperately to cling to the truth of her situation. Yes, he conceded, his thumb brushing the corner of her mouth, a gesture so tender it felt like a threat. But beneath the terror, there is curiosity. And beneath the curiosity, there is heat. I see it in your eyes, Ilara. That spark of rebellion isn't just defiance, it's a challenge. You want to know what it feels like to push against the bars. He didn't move back. Instead, he leaned in further, his intention radiating from him like palpable energy. This was not a physical threat. It was a psychological invasion designed to shatter her composure and force her to confront the reality that she was trapped, body and soul, by a man who made danger look like salvation. You belong to me now, Ilara. That means the boundaries you once held sacred, your privacy, your thoughts, your body, are mine to explore, mine to control. I will break you of your self-possession, piece by agonizing piece, until you understand that your only relief, your only safety, lies in absolute obedience. The dark promise in his eyes was almost unbearable. He was offering her a choice that wasn't a choice at all. Submit to the terrifying sweetness of his ownership, or be crushed by his control. He let the silence stretch, thick with the unspoken tension, until her defiance finally wavered, replaced by a devastating, visceral need to surrender the fight. Damon gave a slow, satisfied nod, recognizing the fracture in her will. He straightened slightly, pulling back just enough to restore a sliver of distance, but the damage was done. He had tasted her fear and found the underlying heat. "Now," he said, the lightness in his voice somehow more terrifying than his earlier intensity. "Tell me about the cockroach-infested studio. Start with the name of the street and the date you moved in, and do not leave out a single detail." Ilara swallowed, her throat dry. The fight had drained out of her, replaced by a hollow, aching acceptance. She was his liability, his secret, and now his subject. She opened her mouth, and the first word of her old life became the first casualty of her new one. "It was on Bleecker Street," she confessed, the word tasting like ash. "I moved in 2 years ago, right after I dropped out of." Damon's eyes held hers, gleaming with triumphant possession. The cage had just locked, and she had just handed him the key. The days bled together in the rarefied air of the penthouse. Ilara's captivity was less about locked doors and more about the suffocating weight of Damon's absolute knowledge. She had fulfilled the first rule of submission, painfully excavating her past and laying it bare for his inspection. He consumed her history, her student loans, the desperate struggle to keep her mother's memory alive, the names of the few people she still cared about, with the same cold, analytical intensity he applied to the city's financial reports. He didn't use her vulnerabilities against her immediately. Instead, he used them to perfect the cage. If she mentioned needing a specific type of tea, it appeared instantly. If she admitted to hating the cold, the temperature of the apartment adjusted to an unnerving, perfect warmth. His control was expressed not through deprivation, but through lavish, relentless provision. He wasn't just holding her prisoner. He was attempting to render her former life obsolete, proving that everything she needed, he could provide, making her dependence absolute. The proximity became the most difficult torture. Damon Volkov did not exist behind closed doors. He worked from the massive marble dining table, conducting global business in 3 languages, while Ilara pretended to read on the adjacent sofa. He moved through the space with the silent, coiled grace of a deep-sea predator, always close enough for her to feel the subtle shift in the air pressure when he passed, always close enough for the scent of his cologne, cedar, smoke, and something vital to catch in her throat. One evening, as the city lights blurred into 1,000 shimmering tears outside the window, Ilara stood by the kitchen island, meticulously peeling an apple, a pointless, desperate act of domestic normalcy. Damon approached from behind, speaking into a secure headset, his voice a low, urgent murmur in Russian. He reached past her for a glass of water, and the expensive fabric of his sleeve brushed the skin of her arm. It was nothing. A fraction of a second of accidental contact, but the shock was immediate, searing, like an electrical fault. Ilara flinched, dropping the apple. It hit the marble with a dull thud and rolled toward the edge. Damon disconnected the call without glancing at the phone. He didn't retrieve the water. His ice-blue gaze locked onto her face, observing the sudden, involuntary dilation of her pupils, the quickening of her breath. He knew. He always knew. "Careful, Malishka," he murmured, the Russian endearment feeling like a dangerous intimacy. He stepped closer, his body heat radiating outward, trapping her against the cold counter. "I just dropped it," she managed, her voice thin. She tried to bend down to retrieve the fruit, but he placed a hand flat on the counter beside her hip, blocking her movement. It wasn't a hard touch, but it was inescapable. "You are trembling, Ilara," he observed, his eyes dropping to the pulse leaping frantically beneath the delicate skin of her throat. "It is not fear that makes you tremble now. We are past the initial terror." The air crackled with the unwanted, ugly truth. She hated the recognition in his eyes, the way he cataloged her physical response. She was attracted to him, to the lethal power, the dangerous control, the sheer masculine certainty that radiated from him. It was a humiliating, terrifying betrayal of everything she stood for. "You are a monster," she whispered, clinging to the only moral high ground she had left. A faint smile touched his lips, devoid of humor. "Yes, and you, little ghost, are fascinated by the darkness. You are a captive, yes, but you are also a woman who finds herself pressed against the edge of a great, beautiful violence, and you want to know what it tastes like." He lifted his other hand and ran the tip of his thumb along the curve of her jaw, tilting her chin up. This contact was deliberate, proprietary, and devastatingly tender. "This is the price of proximity, Ilara. The lines blur until you can no longer distinguish the fear from the hunger. I will not apologize for what I am, but I will show you that submitting to the monster is far more intoxicating than fighting him." The moment stretched, thick and suffocating, threatening to break under the weight of the unspoken tension. She felt herself leaning in, a devastating, unwilling surrender pulling her toward the dark promise in his eyes. Then, salvation arrived in the form of a sharp, insistent ring from a secondary line on his desk phone. Damon swore softly in Russian, the moment shattered. He released her, the sudden withdrawal leaving her cold and shaky, and strode across the room to answer the call, the tailored suit and composed demeanor snapping back into place. Ilara leaned against the counter, breathing shallowly, furious at her own body's betrayal. She needed air. She needed distance. She walked quickly through the living area toward the secondary office, intending to retrieve a forgotten book, anything to stabilize her spinning reality. She didn't knock. The door to the secondary office, usually kept closed, was ajar. And the scene inside arrested her heart in her chest. Damon was standing over a low, steel-reinforced table. He wasn't on a call. He was looking down at a man kneeling on the floor, restrained by two silent, massive guards. The air in this room was different, heavy, metallic, and distinctly scented with iron. The man on the floor was bleeding, not a dramatic, cinematic wound, but a slow, steady seep staining the expensive rug. Damon wasn't touching him, but he held a small, wickedly sharp instrument, a scalpel or an ornate letter opener, in his hand, the tip resting lightly on the man's shoulder. "You told me 3 times," Damon's voice cut through the silence, flat and surgical. "I require only 2. The third lie is gratuitous and expensive." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The lack of emotion was the most terrifying thing. He looked at the kneeling man the way a butcher looks at meat, with professional disinterest. Then Damon moved the instrument, not to kill, but to inflict a sudden, precise, agonizing pain. The sound the man made was swallowed immediately by one of the guards. Ilara pressed her hand against her mouth, stifling a gasp. This was the monster, stripped of the veneer of expensive suits and seductive words. This was the brutal reality of the man who held her captive. He was a professional torturer, a killer, a predator who dealt in blood and pain with clinical ease. She backed away silently, her fear a suffocating weight, Returning to the vast living room, she collapsed onto the sofa, her hands gripping the silk pillow, staring blindly at the glittering, indifferent city. The moment of unwilling intimacy, the confusing heat that had flared between them moments ago, now felt like a terrifying, dangerous joke. But as the adrenaline receded, something else took root, a visceral, sickening fascination. The raw, unleashed power she had witnessed was horrifying, yes, but it was also magnetic. The monster was real, and he was breathtakingly dangerous. She realized with a sickening lurch that her fear was no longer pure. It was tangled now, irrevocably, with a perverse, agonizing attraction to the man who could destroy her with a word or with the slightest, most precise movement of his hand. The office door clicked shut. Damon returned, wiping his hands on a pristine white handkerchief, which he then tossed into a waste receptacle. He saw her, curled tight against the sofa, her face pale, and he knew she had seen something. He walked over, his shadow falling over her, replacing the light. He leaned down, his eyes holding the familiar, possessive gleam. He didn't ask what she saw. He didn't need to. "Did you learn something new, Alara?" he asked, his voice low and rich, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive leather. "I told you I was dangerous. Now you know the full scope of my control. Remember this feeling." He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, the gesture utterly incongruous with the brutality she had just witnessed. "That terror you feel, it is the purest form of submission. And it is the most honest thing you feel for me. Never forget that the velvet glove conceals the iron fist. And you, Malishka, are safe only when you are held securely within both." The night Damon Volkov decided to introduce his captive to the gilded cage of his world, the air in the penthouse crackled with a sterile, terrifying excitement. Ilara was not merely dressed, she was meticulously curated, transformed into an artifact of staggering, unaffordable luxury. A team of silent attendants materialized, working on her with the precision of surgeons preparing a specimen. The gown was deep emerald silk, a single, fluid column that required absolute stillness to wear. It was cut high on the thigh and impossibly low on the back, exposing skin that felt suddenly vulnerable. The color was chosen, she realized, to complement the ice blue brilliance of the diamond necklace Damon fastened around her throat, a constellation of stones that felt heavy, anchoring her to the floor. The weight of the jewels was the physical manifestation of her dependence, a sparkling chain reinforcing the iron walls of the penthouse. When the attendants finally retreated, leaving only the scent of expensive perfume and the faint metallic tang of hairspray, Damon entered the dressing suite. He wore black bespoke Italian, cut to emphasize the lethal breadth of his shoulders. His gaze swept over her, clinical and possessive, lingering on the exposed curve of her collarbone. "Perfect," he stated, the word a verdict, not a compliment. "You look exactly like a liability worth protecting." Ilara lifted her chin, meeting his eyes in the mirror. She didn't recognize the woman reflected back, not the haunted student who answered the wrong call, but a striking, untouchable stranger, glittering with borrowed wealth. "What is the occasion?" "A gathering of vultures," Damon replied, adjusting the cufflink on his wrist. "The annual formal charity event hosted by the Petrov family. It's where business is finalized, alliances are tested, and territory is subtly negotiated. Tonight, you are my ornament, Ilara, the untouchable mistress. Remember your instructions." She swallowed, the diamonds pressing cold against her skin. "Stay silent. Stay close." "More than that," he corrected, stepping behind her, his large hands resting lightly on her bare shoulders, sending a tremor through her system. The touch was non-sexual, purely proprietary, marking his territory. "You will project absolute boredom. You will look at everyone as if they are slightly beneath you. You are a creature of exquisite value, and you belong exclusively to me. Do not smile unless I prompt it. Your role is simple: to prove that I am secure enough to bring my most precious secret into the viper's nest and know absolutely that no one dares touch it." His proximity was a dizzying rush of fear and unwanted heat. She was dressed like a queen, but felt like a sacrificial lamb. The journey down was a descent into a world she only saw on the news. The armored car, the silent security detail, the sheer, undeniable force of Damon's presence. When they arrived, the atmosphere was a suffocating blend of old money and raw power. The ballroom was excessive. Crystal chandeliers, gold leaf, and music that masked the quiet danger humming beneath the surface. Damon operated in his element with effortless grace. He moved through the crowd like a king surveying his domain. His hand remained a steady, crushing weight on the small of her back, guiding her, controlling her speed, and dictating her proximity to others. He introduced her to no one, speaking only in cold, clipped sentences when necessary, maintaining the necessary distance for the untouchable mistress persona. Ilara watched him, mesmerized and horrified. He smiled, a breathtaking, practiced curve of the lips that didn't reach his eyes, while discussing multi-million-dollar deals with Asian titans. He nodded, politely lethal, while issuing subtle threats that she, having witnessed his private brutality, knew were absolutely real. The man who had run a scalpel across a kneeling man's shoulder was now charming a senator's wife. The duality was terrifyingly attractive. She was playing the part perfectly, her expression fixed in a mask of elegant indifference, but internally, she was a frantic mess. The fear tonight was different. It was external, ambient, shared by everyone in the room. This was the true hierarchy of the criminal world, and Damon Volkov stood undeniably at the apex. Midway through the evening, while Damon was engaged in a low, intense discussion with a man whose face was scarred by an old wound, Ilara felt a gaze settle on her. It wasn't the usual appreciative, hungry look she'd been deflecting. This gaze was analytical, cold, and assessing, slicing through her composure. She instinctively turned her head. Across the room, near a column draped in white roses, stood a man in his late 50s, lean and sharp, with eyes the color of polished obsidian. He was Victor Karski, the man Damon had been meant to call, the intended recipient of her accidental answer. Victor Karski wasn't looking at the diamonds or the dress. He was looking at her. And in his eyes, Ilara saw a flicker of something unsettling, not recognition of her face, but a sudden, sharp suspicion that she didn't belong. He looked like a man who had misplaced a crucial puzzle piece and was just now finding it under a rug. A chill, colder than the air conditioning, ran down Ilara's spine. Karski wasn't seeing Damon's mistress. He was seeing a loose end. He was seeing the woman who, by answering the wrong number, had derailed a crucial exchange of information, or worse, intercepted it. The gaze held, relentless and calculating, for a second too long. Ilara felt her composure crumble. She inhaled sharply, her breath catching in her throat. Before Karski could move or even shift his weight, Damon's discussion ended. Damon didn't look across the room, but he felt the shift in tension, the break in Ilara's performance. His hand instantly tightened on her back, his fingers digging into the small dip above her spine, a silent, painful command. "Look at me, Ilara," he murmured, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the man he was speaking to, yet his attention was entirely on her. "I told you to hold the facade." She obeyed instantly, snapping her gaze up to his profile. But it was too late. Karski had seen the flash of panic, and, more importantly, he had seen Damon's immediate proprietary reaction. Damon maintained his composure for precisely 60 more seconds, concluding the conversation with terrifying politeness. Then, without a word, he executed a swift pivot, pulling Ilara in his wake. The movement was so smooth, it looked like a natural departure, but the sheer force of his grip communicated the urgency. They didn't speak until they were back in the armored car, speeding away from the ballroom's false light. Damon released her only when the doors locked with a heavy metallic click, surrounding them in silence. He didn't yell, he didn't touch her, he simply watched her, his expression colder than the diamonds she wore. "You broke character," he stated, the accusation flat and absolute. "You drew attention, not to the dress, but to the panic behind your eyes." "I saw him," Ilara whispered, trembling. "Victor Karski. He looked at me, Damon. He looked like he knew I shouldn't be here." Damon leaned forward, his massive frame folding into the leather seat, dominating the enclosed space. "Karski is intelligent. He knows I never bring a woman to that event unless she is critical. He saw the shift in your focus, the sudden vulnerability, and he is now calculating why a woman who looks like an expensive trophy would have the eyes of a terrified witness." He reached out, his hand wrapping around her wrist, pulling her arm toward him. He lifted the heavy diamond bracelet she wore, inspecting the flawless stones, but his gaze remained fixed on her face. "You are not just a secret, Ilara," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "You are a curiosity, and Karski is the man who was meant to receive the call you answered. He is now wondering if you know something he doesn't." Damon let go of her wrist, the bracelet clattering against the seat. The diamonds suddenly felt like a target painted on her skin. The gilded cage had just opened, and she had stepped out only long enough to confirm that the world outside was infinitely more lethal. Her mistake, her single, terrifying error, had finally been noticed by the true enemy. "You did exactly what I told you not to do," Damon concluded, the finality chilling. "You made yourself a target. And since you are my property, Ilara, that means Karski has just set his sights on me. We are no longer playing a game of submission. We are playing a game of survival, and every rival in this city now knows that the key to disrupting Damon Volkov is the beautiful, fragile woman he holds close." He reached out, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her jaw, a renewed sense of ruthless possession in his eyes. "Don't worry, Malishka. I will protect my investment, but the price of your proximity just went up, and I always collect." Damon didn't take Ilara back to the penthouse. The moment they arrived at the underground garage, the level of security shifted from impressive to paranoid. Instead of ascending, they transferred immediately into a secondary, unmarked SUV, which was already running and waiting in an auxiliary tunnel. The air inside the vehicle was thick with Damon's barely contained fury, a low, dangerous hum that vibrated in her bones. "Where are we going?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper, the heavy diamonds still cold against her collarbone. "Somewhere more difficult to breach," Damon replied, his eyes scanning the closed-circuit monitors mounted discreetly in the ceiling of the vehicle. His jaw was tight, the muscle twitching near his ear. "Karski made his move the moment you panicked. He didn't send a threat, he sent a probe. He wanted to see how tightly I was holding the leash and how valuable you truly are. Now he knows." The SUV plunged into the city's underbelly, navigating a series of private, unmarked access roads that felt less like transit routes and more like fortified arteries. Ilara stared out the window at the blurred concrete, the movement of frantic escape. She was no longer just an object of desire. She was a strategic liability, a piece of chess that a rival was attempting to steal. "He will try to extract you, Ilara," Damon continued, his voice devoid of warmth, purely strategic. "Not because he wants you, but because taking my property is the most direct way to cripple me. He sees you as a weakness. I see you as a necessity. The difference, little ghost, is one of approach." He reached into the console and pulled out a heavy, matte black pistol. It wasn't menacingly displayed. He checked the clip with the professional disinterest of a man reviewing inventory. He placed it back within easy reach. The warning came not as a sound, but as a sickening, heavy thud that rattled the armored chassis. The vehicle immediately swerved, the driver cursing sharply in a language Alara didn't recognize. Before the SUV could correct its course, the world outside exploded in violence. The sound of automatic gunfire was deafening, a relentless, tearing noise that seemed to chew the air itself. Ilara screamed, pressing herself against the leather seat, hands flying up to protect her head. The reinforced glass of the windows spiderwebbed under the impact, but miraculously, it held. Damon moved instantly. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He was already reaching for the weapon, his body language shifting from controlled businessman to apex predator in the span of a single heartbeat. The driver managed to slam the car into an emergency stop, blocking the narrow tunnel. "Stay down, Ilara," Damon commanded, his voice a low, throaty roar that cut through the chaos. It wasn't a plea or a suggestion. It was an order delivered with absolute finality. Through the fragmented window, Ilara saw the ambush, 2 dark sedans positioned to box them in, and a handful of men in tactical gear emerging, weapons raised. They were professionals, moving with swift, brutal efficiency. One of them, a thick-set man with a scarred face, recognized Damon's vehicle and began shouting orders in Russian. Damon didn't wait for a breach. He opened his door, the metallic crunch of the heavy armor slicing through the noise, and stepped out directly into the maelstrom. What Ilara witnessed next was not a fight, it was an execution. The elegance and control Damon displayed in the ballroom, the quiet, measured cruelty he exhibited in his office, were gone. This was raw, untamed savagery. He moved too fast for the eye to track, a blur of tailored black suit and lethal intent. He didn't rely on the handgun alone. He used the cover of the car, the geometry of the tunnel, and the sheer force of his body. The men trying to flank him were met with explosive, instantaneous violence. A muffled sound, a terrible, wet crack, and the scarred man crumpled, his weapon clattering uselessly on the concrete. Ilara watched, paralyzed, her breath trapped in her throat. The smell of burnt gunpowder and hot metal was overpowering, mixing sickeningly with the first sharp, coppery scent of blood that wafted into the car. She saw Damon grapple with a second attacker, his strength inhuman, his movements precise. He wasn't just neutralizing the threat, he was eradicating it with extreme prejudice. He broke the man's arm with a short, sharp twist, then used the body as a shield against the incoming fire from the third attacker. The violence was absolute, terrifying, and mesmerizing. This was the true, unleashed power that had been simmering beneath the surface, the power that kept the entire ecosystem of his dark world in check. He was fighting not for a cause, but for possession. The ambush lasted perhaps 90 seconds, then silence. A heavy, ringing, absolute silence, broken only by the rapid, gasping breaths of the driver and the low, heavy panting of Damon. Ilara dared to look up. Damon was standing over the last man, who was lying motionless, the tunnel floor slick beneath him. Damon's suit was ripped at the shoulder, and a dark bloom of blood was spreading across his pristine white cuff, but he was otherwise untouched. He was breathing deeply, adrenaline pouring off him like heat, his eyes dark, vast pools of unrestrained fury. He looked at the wreckage, then slowly, deliberately, turned and walked back toward the SUV. He didn't look at the bodies. They were irrelevant. He looked only at the armored door, and then at Ilara. He slid back into the seat, the smell of fresh blood clinging to him. He didn't wipe the crimson smear from his cheek. He was the monster, utterly unveiled. He tossed the pistol onto the seat between them, the metallic weight landing with a clatter. Ilara felt the last vestiges of her moral resistance shatter. She was terrified of the blood, the sheer brutality, the casual destruction. But beneath the terror, a devastating, ugly truth took root. She was alive. She was safe. And the reason she was safe was the man sitting beside her, dripping violence and adrenaline. He reached out, his hand, still slightly trembling from the exertion, still stained with the life of his enemies, cupping the back of her neck. His grip was firm, possessive, drawing her close until her forehead rested against his shoulder, pressing into the damp fabric of his suit. "You see, Ilara," he murmured, his voice rough, laced with the lingering heat of the kill. "They tried to take you. They tried to prove I was weak. They tried to hurt me by touching what is mine." He wasn't comforting her. He was instructing her. He tightened his grip, pulling her closer to the scent of danger, the primal musk of his victory. "Never forget this, Malishka," he whispered fiercely into her hair. "The outside world is not kind. It does not offer safety. It only offers predators stronger than you. I am a monster, yes, but I am your monster, and I will burn the world down before I let another man lay a finger on what belongs to me. This violence, it is the price of your security. And you are worth every drop of blood." The realization was sickening, yet profoundly settling. The iron fist was not just for discipline. It was a shield. She was trapped in the cage, but the cage was fortified with the bodies of his rivals. She was horrified by the man she clung to, yet a perverse, primal part of her soul finally felt the absolute, unshakable security of being owned by something utterly ruthless. The fear remained, but now it was directed entirely inward, at the terrifying, consuming nature of her own attraction. The sanctuary was cold, silent, and utterly anonymous. Damon had brought her to a secure apartment tower far from his usual haunts, a place of gray steel and glass, designed for functionality, not comfort. The transition from the tunnel's blood-soaked chaos to the apartment's sterile marble and low lighting was jarring, throwing the sheer reality of the attack into sharp relief. Ilara didn't remember the drive. She only remembered the scent of gunpowder, the heavy weight of Damon's hand on her neck, and the chilling realization that the diamonds still pressed against her skin felt less like jewelry and more like shackles. When they arrived, she moved like a sleepwalker, propelled by muscle memory and Damon's silent direction. He led her straight into a pristine white bathroom, ignoring the lavish living space. He didn't speak. He simply stood behind her and, with rough efficiency, began to remove the remnants of the night. The silk gown was peeled away, dropping in a shimmering heap of discarded evidence. The heavy diamond necklace was unclasped, the stones clicking softly as he tossed them onto the marble counter. She was left standing in her slip, exposed and trembling. The contrast between her vulnerability and the ruthless power clinging to Damon was absolute. He was still in the torn, blood-spattered suit, the dark stain on his cuff now dry and crusty, the raw, aggressive scent of adrenaline and copper clinging to him like a second skin. "Shower," he finally commanded, his voice hoarse, the sound grating in the sudden quiet. "Wash the filth off." Ilara stepped beneath the scalding water, hoping the heat would burn away the images of splintered bone and arterial spray. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink and stinging, trying to erase the ghost of the metallic odor that had permeated her pores. But the true filth wasn't on her skin. It was the sickening, undeniable sense of safety that had settled in her core, a security born of violent subjugation. When she emerged, wrapped in a thick white robe, Damon was gone from the bathroom. She found him in the main room, seated in a low leather chair. He had changed his clothes, now wearing dark tactical pants and a simple black long-sleeved shirt, and was meticulously cleaning the matte black pistol from the car, the rhythmic clicks of the mechanism the only sound in the room. He looked up when she entered, his eyes heavy, the lingering exhaustion of the fight giving his features a grim intensity. He wasn't the polished Mafia boss anymore. He was the executioner, resting between kills. "Come here, Ilara," he said, not pausing his work. The command was soft, yet unwavering. She obeyed, crossing the sterile floor on bare feet. She stopped before him, the distance between them feeling vast, yet non-existent. He set the pistol down and reached out, his hand lifting to cup her face. His thumb brushed the damp curve of her cheekbone. His touch was no longer rough, but assessing. He was looking for cracks, for permanent damage. "You didn't shatter," he observed, his gaze boring into hers. "You were terrified, but you remained still. You understood the instruction." "I understood what would happen if I moved," she whispered, the honesty tasting like ash. "I saw what you did. I saw the cost of disobedience." Damon's lips curved slightly, a dark, unsettling acknowledgement. "The cost of disobedience is death, yes. The cost of loyalty, however, is merely your freedom. And tonight, Ilara, you chose wisely. You chose the lesser fear." He removed his hand from her face and shifted his focus to her neck, tracing the delicate line of her collarbone where the heavy diamonds had rested hours earlier. The absence of the jewelry emphasized her fragility, the pale skin a stark contrast to his dark fingers. You know now that the danger is not just me, he continued, his voice a low, gravelly confession. The danger is the world that wants to use you against me. Karski saw the look in your eyes. He saw the crack in the facade, and he will use it. He will try to tempt you, bribe you, or simply take you. He leaned forward, his gaze locking with hers, stripping away every layer of pretense. What I offer you is a gilded cage, yes, but it is a cage fortified by the bodies of men who would see you broken. I am a possessive, ruthless bastard. But I am an honest one. I own you, and that ownership dictates your survival. Tonight proved that. The atmosphere thickened, weighted by the truth they were both forced to accept. Ilara felt the horrifying realization bloom. The monster was her only defense. The darkness she feared was the shield that kept the deeper, external darkness at bay. Her fear of Damon had been a necessary distraction from the fear of oblivion. She raised her hand, trembling slightly, and reached out to touch the faint crimson smear still visible near his temple, the blood of a man he had killed just an hour ago. It was a morally devastating gesture, an instinctive reaching toward the source of her safety. Damon froze, his breath catching. He watched her finger brush the dried blood, testing her limits, testing her surrender. "You are not soft, Malishka," he murmured, the term of endearment sounding less like affection and more like a title of ownership. "You are resilient. I thought you would crumble, but you watched the fire and you clung to the heat." He took her wrist, pulling her hand away from his face and pressing her palm flat against his chest, right over the steady, heavy beat of his heart. The fabric of his shirt was warm, smelling faintly of clean linen and the primal, lingering musk of the fight. "This is not love, Ilara," he stated, his voice rough, cementing the terms of their unspoken pact. "Love is weak. Love is a vulnerability my enemies can exploit. This is necessity. This is possession. This is the understanding that your life depends on my control, and my success depends on your silence." He didn't ask for her commitment. He demanded her acceptance. His eyes held no tenderness, only the profound, possessive hunger of a man who had claimed a rare, dangerous prize and was willing to destroy anything that threatened it. Ilara didn't resist. She closed her eyes, letting the terrifying security of his presence wash over her. She knew, with chilling certainty, that she was lost. She had accepted the terms of the trade, her soul for her survival. She had answered the call of the monster, and now she belonged entirely to the violence. "Stay close," she whispered, the words barely audible, a fractured prayer of ultimate surrender. Damon's grip on her wrist tightened, possessive and absolute. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a hard, measured kiss to her knuckles, not a lover's salute, but a seal on a ruthless contract. "Always," he confirmed, his voice a promise of eternal, terrifying ownership. "Now, sleep. We have work to do when the sun rises. The game has changed. And you, Ilara, are the prize I refuse to lose." The morning light filtering into the sterile apartment felt thin and unforgiving. Damon had spent the hours before dawn on encrypted calls, his voice a low, gravelly counterpoint to the quiet hum of the air conditioning. He didn't offer Ilara coffee or comfort. He offered her the next phase of the war. She sat across from him at the polished steel table, wrapped in the borrowed robe, watching him dissect the battlefield. He was all cold calculation now, The feral heat of the previous night banked into a focused, lethal intensity. He had maps spread out, not of territories or trade routes, but of Karski's known movements, his weak points, and, most importantly, his pride. Anton Karski is a rat, Damon stated, tapping a precise location on the map, a defunct shipyard near the docks. He runs when cornered, and he only attacks what he perceives as soft. He believes you are my softness, my liability. Ilara swallowed, the memory of the ambush still a cold weight in her stomach. He tried to take me. He failed. He failed the snatch, but he succeeded in proving the worth of the prize, Damon corrected, his eyes locking onto hers, demanding unflinching honesty. He won't try another ambush. It's too messy. He will try to lure you out, or bait me into a position where I must prioritize your rescue over my defenses. We will save him the trouble. Damon pushed the map aside, leaning forward until his shadow fell entirely over her. The air crackled with the sheer force of his intent. I will not live under constant threat, Ilara. I will not have my attention divided by the need to fortify every exit and check every shadow. The only way out of this is through him. Permanently. He paused, letting the weight of the proposal settle. We use you as bait. The words were blunt, uncompromising. Ilara felt the expected surge of terror, but it was quickly eclipsed by a fierce, protective calculation. She was the reason he was exposed. She was the crack in his armor. If Karski lived, she would always be the target, always a pawn vulnerable to theft. Her survival was intrinsically linked to Karski's demise and to Damon's absolute victory. How? She asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the internal tremors. Damon's lips curved into a slow, satisfied smile, a smile devoid of warmth, purely of appreciation for her ruthlessness. I knew you wouldn't crumble. I will make you visible. I will make you look unprotected, yet desirable. The ultimate prize left carelessly within reach. Karski thinks he can steal my heart. We will show him that I keep only iron in its place. He spent the next 2 hours detailing the plan, a symphony of engineered vulnerability, security redundancies, and precise timing. It was a high-risk gamble, relying entirely on Karski's hubris and Ilara's ability to hold the line under duress. You understand the danger, Malishka, Damon concluded, standing up. If Karski gets within striking distance, he will not hesitate to eliminate you just to watch me bleed. This is not a simulation. You must be prepared to look death in the face and not flinch. Ilara rose, discarding the robe. She stood before him in the simple white slip, exposed yet determined. I have seen death, Damon. I watched you execute men in a tunnel. I know the cost. The game has changed, yes. If I am the weapon, then point me at the target. His eyes darkened, reading the absolute resolve in her gaze. She wasn't agreeing out of obedience. She was agreeing out of a shared, necessary violence. He reached out and gripped her chin, tilting her face up. This was not the kiss of a lover, but the rough, possessive taste of a contract sealed in blood. Good, he breathed against her lips. Then let's go hunt. The location was the grand, decaying ballroom of an old, abandoned theater, a place rife with shadows and echoes. Damon had chosen it for its historical visibility and its structural complexity, which allowed his own men to melt into the architecture while leaving Alara devastatingly exposed on the cracked marble floor. She was dressed again, but this time not in the armor of diamonds, but in a sheath of crimson silk, a striking, deliberate contrast against the gloom. She was a beacon, a target, a living provocation. She stood exactly where Damon had instructed her, a solitary figure under the single harsh spotlight he had arranged. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Alara focused on the rhythmic pounding of her own heart, anchoring herself in the present. She was terrified, yet strangely empowered. This was her choice, her active participation in the darkness. She was no longer just the captive, she was the catalyst. Then the doors creaked open, and Anton Karski stepped into the light, flanked by 2 armed men. He wasn't a shadow this time. He was arrogant, confident, believing the lure had worked. "Damon," Karski called out, his voice echoing cruelly through the empty space. "I see you brought me a gift. How careless of you to leave such a beautiful thing unwrapped." "The wrapping is merely for appearances, Anton," Damon's voice cut in, cold and sharp, coming from the balcony high above. "The contents are fortified steel." The confrontation detonated instantly. Damon's men erupted from the shadows, securing the exits. Karski realized too late that he hadn't stolen the prize. He had walked into the jaws of the trap. The ballroom was immediately swallowed by the sound of gunfire, a deafening, frantic exchange. Alara didn't move. She held her ground, a statue in crimson, watching the whirlwind of violence unfold around her. Her eyes were fixed on Damon, who descended the grand staircase with lethal grace, engaging Karski directly. The 2 bosses met in the center of the floor, the gunfight receding into the background as their personal, brutal struggle took center stage. Karski was quick and desperate. Damon was methodical and overwhelming. They grappled, their movements tight and vicious, punctuated by the grunts of exertion and the metallic screech of a knife being drawn. Alara watched, her breath shallow. Damon had Karski pinned against a pillar, the knife raised for the killing blow. But Karski had a final, desperate card. His remaining guard, hidden partially behind the pillar, managed to raise his weapon, aiming not at Damon's head, but for his flank, planning a debilitating shot. Time slowed. Damon was entirely focused on the man in his grasp. He didn't see the second threat. He was vulnerable. The realization hit Alara with the force of a physical blow. If Damon fell, she was alone, unprotected, facing Karski's vengeance. She acted purely on instinct, driven by the primal, devastating need to protect her shield. Nearby, one of Damon's fallen men had dropped his tactical knife. Without thinking, Alara lunged forward, snatching the heavy blade from the floor. She moved with a desperate, clumsy speed, closing the distance to the guard. The guard, realizing the distraction too late, turned his focus from Damon to the unexpected, furious blur of crimson rushing toward him. He hesitated for a fatal second. She was just a woman, a fragile prize. Alara didn't aim for the chest or the throat. She drove the knife downward with all her strength, plunging the blade deep into the man's thigh. A sickening, wet grunt escaped him as his knee buckled, the weapon firing wildly into the ceiling as he collapsed. The distraction was momentary, but it was enough. Damon, alerted by the sudden shift in the fight, glanced over his shoulder, his eyes wide, momentarily stunned by the sight of Ilara, her hands slick with a stranger's blood, standing over the downed threat. Karski seized the opportunity, shoving Damon back, scrambling for his own dropped pistol. But Damon was faster. Fueled by a terrifying surge of possessive fury, not just at Karski's defiance, but at the sheer nerve of anyone who dared to threaten Ilara, he launched forward. There was a terrible, final sound, a ragged, tearing noise, and Karski slumped, lifeless, against the pillar. Silence returned, thick and absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of Damon's men securing the periphery. Damon didn't look at Karski's body. He didn't look at his men. He turned, slowly, his focus narrowing entirely on Ilara. She stood panting, the crimson dress stained with the darker, visceral crimson of the enemy, the knife still clutched in her hand. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear, with the shock of necessary action. He crossed the floor in 3 long strides, taking the knife from her numb fingers and tossing it aside. He gripped her face, his gaze searching hers, looking for the breaking point. "You chose," he breathed, his voice raw with adrenaline and a dark, overwhelming. "You chose me." Ilara leaned into his touch, the smell of gunpowder and fresh blood overwhelming. She had crossed the line. She was no longer an innocent victim. She was a participant, stained by the violence that kept her alive. She was his accomplice, his shield, his equal in ruthlessness. "I chose to survive," she whispered, the honesty a devastating surrender. Damon pulled her against him, crushing her to his chest, the victory absolute. "You are not just mine, Malishka," he murmured fiercely into her hair, kissing the crown of her head with brutal tenderness. "You are essential. You are the only woman who has ever chosen to fight beside the monster. And now the world knows who you belong to. You are secured forever." The blood on her dress felt less like contamination and more like an anointing. She had answered the call to violence, and by doing so, she had earned her place beside the man who ruled the dark, solidified in the hierarchy of his world by her own desperate, murderous choice. The silence that fell over the abandoned theater was heavier than the gunfire had been, a suffocating blanket woven from smoke, dust, and the irreversible stench of death. Damon held Ilara pressed against his chest, the crimson silk of her dress absorbing the heat and the blood of his tactical gear. His men moved with quiet, efficient speed, securing the periphery, beginning the grim work of erasure. But Damon was immobile, anchored entirely by the fierce grip he had on the woman in his arms. He finally pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs wiping away a smear of grime and sweat near her temple. His eyes, usually cold, burned with a frightening, intense combination of fury and triumph. He saw the viscous sheen of blood on her hands, the shock still rattling in her eyes, and a primal, terrifying tenderness overtook him. "Look at me, Ilara," he commanded, his voice deep and unsteady. "Look at what you did." She obeyed, meeting his gaze. She didn't look away from the horror. She looked through it, straight into the dark core of their shared reality. She had chosen the monstrous path, and the adrenaline was giving way to a cold, hard clarity. "I saved you," she stated, the words scraped raw from her throat. It wasn't a question or a plea. It was a statement of fact, the brutal basis of their new covenant. Yes, Damon affirmed, the single word a benediction of ownership. He kissed her then, not with the bruising dominance of the night before, but with a thorough, possessive gratitude. It was a kiss that tasted of metallic blood and gunpowder, a seal pressed onto a contract written in violence. He didn't wait for her to regain her composure. He simply lifted her, gathering her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and carried her out of the ruined ballroom. She rested her head against the hard, reliable muscle of his shoulder, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart, the heart she had just fought to protect. The next hours blurred into a sterile transition. They did not return to the high-rise apartment. Instead, they were taken to a secluded estate outside the city limits, a fortress disguised as a luxury retreat. Damon left her only long enough to confirm Karski's finality and to issue orders that would ripple through his organization, cementing his position and eradicating any possible fallout. When she found him, he was standing on a private terrace overlooking manicured gardens, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. He had showered and changed into crisp, custom-tailored clothes, the executioner now once again the powerful, polished man who demanded loyalty and fear in equal measure. The only remnant of the fight was the lethal stillness in his posture. Alara was wrapped in a fresh silk dressing gown, her hair still damp. The blood was gone, washed away, but the knowledge of what she had done was an indelible stain on her soul. Damon turned as she approached. He didn't smile. He simply extended his hand, and she walked across the distance to meet him, not out of compulsion, but necessity. "Karski is gone," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The threat is neutralized. The game we were playing is over. You are no longer required as a captive, Malishka." Alara felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, colder than any fear of death. This was the moment of truth. The moment he might offer her the freedom she no longer desired, the freedom that felt thin and unprotected compared to the terrifying density of his presence. "I don't want it," she whispered, the admission tearing itself from her chest. "I don't want to go back." His lips twitched, a shadow of satisfaction crossing his face. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist, caging her securely against him. "I know. You tasted the steel tonight, Ilara. You saw what happens when I am exposed. You chose to be my shield. That choice has consequences far greater than mere captivity." He tilted her chin up, forcing her to look into the abyssal depth of his eyes. "I could offer you a plane ticket, a new identity, and the delusion of a normal life. But that would be a lie. That world is fragile. That world would leave you vulnerable to the next predator, the next desperate man who wants to dismantle my kingdom." He paused, letting the weight of his promise crush the air between them. "I will not offer you freedom. I will offer you everything else. This world, the power, the safety, the opulence, it is yours, provided you never, for one single moment, question your place." He didn't need to elaborate. The place was his. The position was defined by his ownership. "You are mine, Alara," he continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate confession that was more absolute than any vow. "Not because I keep you locked in a room, but because you chose to stand in the blood beside me. You are my most dangerous, most valuable possession. And the moment you cease to accept that, the moment you try to take back what you willingly surrendered, the gilded cage will become a gilded tomb. His threat was layered, not with malice, but with the stark, lethal honesty of his commitment. It wasn't a threat of punishment. It was a promise of eternal, inescapable inclusion. Ilara closed her eyes, letting the darkness of his words settle like a heavy, comforting blanket. She recalled the moment she had answered the wrong number, the accidental call that had sounded the death knell of her old life. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been destiny. She opened her eyes and met his possessive gaze, the last flicker of her former self extinguished. "I accept the terms," she whispered. "I am yours, Damon, forever." Damon reacted instantly, crushing her mouth under his. This kiss was the final, devastating affirmation. It was a claiming that went past the physical, sinking into the very bone marrow of her being. He was sealing her to him with the weight of his power, the heat of his possessiveness, and the unwavering promise of security. When he pulled back, his hand slipped beneath her silk robe, finding the warm skin of her waist and gripping it tightly. "Good," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear. "Because now that I have you, Malishka, the only way you leave this life is in a box. And I intend to keep you alive and entirely mine for a very long time." He led her away from the terrace, toward the shadowed interior of the safe house, toward the future they had forged in fire and blood. Ilara walked willingly, fully aware that the freedom she lost was the price of the life she gained. She had answered the call by mistake, but she had chosen the darkness with absolute certainty. She was Damon's, and in his terrifying ownership, she finally found her place.